Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining ISA's book discussion on Regional Investment Pioneers in South Asia, the Payoff of Knowing Your Neighbours. This book explores the potential of intra-regional and some understudied constraints to such investments, as well as emphasizing the role of knowledge connecting in boosting cross-border engagements. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following panelists: Professor Sanjay Kathuria, Senior Visiting Fellow, Center for Policy Research, India, Non-Resident Senior Fellow at Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and author of Regional Investment Pioneers in South Asia, The Payoff of Knowing Your Neighbours. Dr. Masudur Rahman, Visiting Research Fellow at ISAS NUS, Dr. Dil Bahadur Rahut, Senior Research Fellow and Economist at Asian Development Bank Institute, Dr. Nishchal Pandey, Director, Center for South Asian Studies, Convener, Consortium of South Asian Think Tanks, and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at ISAS NUS, Dr. Sajid Amin Javed, Research Fellow at Sustainable Development Policy Institute, SDPI, Pakistan, Dr. Ganeshan Vignoraja, Senior Research Associate at Overseas Development Institute, London, and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at ISAS. Today's session is moderated by Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead for Trade and Economic Policy at ISAS. Before we proceed with the event, we would appreciate it if the audience could switch off their microphones and videos throughout the session. The panelists are requested to keep their videos on. If you have any questions or feedback to share during the proceeding, please forward them via this chat, and they will be consolidated for the panelists to respond during the Q&A session later. This book discussion is live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page right now. I will now invite Dr. Palit to make the introductory remarks and chair the discussion. Dr. Palit, please.
Thank you so much, Kuntavi. A very good morning to everybody, depending upon which part of the world you are based in, and also good evening at the same time, depending upon where you are based in right now. It's a great pleasure to have all of you with us today in this very interesting and very enlightening event, which I'm expecting it to be, because this discussion of today is focused on a subject which is very significant and at the same time a bit unusual. And let me explain why I say so. When we look at South Asia as a region from an economic perspective, the foremost and popular conclusion that one tends to draw about South Asia is the fact that it is the least economically integrated region of the world. And when one says that, perhaps one comes in with a variety of visions, but one of the most common visions that people have about South Asia is that this is a region where the countries of the region are really reluctant to engage with each other as much as possible, as much the potential is, insofar as cross-border trade and investment is concerned. So as a result of that, the region really has not been in a position to give birth to its own regional supply chains. The movement of people within the region itself has not been as much as it could have been. And within the region, the countries have, perhaps knowingly or unwillingly, created barriers to movement of goods, to movement of people, to movement of capital, and also knowledge and ideas. And this is from where one probably begins with a somewhat cynical impression of South Asia as an economic region. And one tends to be a little bit diffident about the fact that South Asia has a low bottom line insofar as regional integration is concerned, and it is hardly a region which can, at any point in time, aspire to reach the same levels of internal integration as Southeast Asia. And let's not even bring in the European Union in that context. Well, some of it might be true, but some of it also is a matter of perception. And a lot of it is the question of probably putting the nuts and bolts in order, which would enable the region to energize its economic momentum in a fairly active and robust fashion. In that respect, a lot of discussion focuses on regional trade. But the reason why I find today's discussion unusual and very significant is the economic discussion on South Asia does not really focus too much on investments. And today's discussion has investments at its heart. This reflects on a report which is on the regional investment pioneers in South Asia. And very interestingly, the subtitle is The Payoff of Knowing Your Neighbors. Now, I think I will not go into the details of the report because we have one of the authors of the report, Professor Sanjay Kathuria, who is going to take us through the contents of the report. But what I'd like to leave you with is the thought that many a times we probably tend to undermine the role of capital insofar as bringing countries together is concerned. Today, South Asia is a region where a lot of internal movement of capital is either happening or can happen if the conditions are clear and if there are certain internal policy issues or regulations that the host countries can take care of. I think this is a truth which we will come to firmly embrace once we go through the contents that Professor Kathuria has to share with us. And probably we will end with the hope that down the line and in the not too distant future, South Asia will actually turn out to be a region where it will perhaps, along with external sources of investment, talk very prominently about the internal sources of investment as well within itself. With that hope and that thought, let me now invite Professor Sanjay Kathuria to share his views about this report with us. Professor Kathuria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amitendu, and thanks to the Institute of South Asian Studies for taking, and of course, I am affiliated with that, so I'm very happy that this, can you hear me or can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you, Sanjay.
Okay.
We can hear you.
I think this interest in this report, and Amitendu has set it up beautifully, the context of the report. And I'm very happy. I would like to also acknowledge the fact that this was in a sense my a legacy project of mine at the World Bank. I retired from the World Bank 2 years ago, but this report was still work in progress. And with my co-authors, Ravindra Yatawara and Xiao Zhu, we did manage to complete this actually massive effort. And many institutions all over South Asia were involved in the survey work that was done as part of this report. So thank you to all of them who helped us in completing this report. And I'm also very grateful to my distinguished fellow panelists who will comment on the report and their particular context. So Kuntavi, I'm ready to start the slideshow if you are.
Sure, let me just share them now.
Yeah. Okay, so you can see it, right? Okay, so let me start with then the context, the approach, and the key findings. I'll start with that, and then I'll go to a little bit about the outward investment regimes in different countries in South Asia, and I'll talk about connectivity and trust. I think a key concept that we bring in the report is knowledge connectivity. We'll talk a little bit about the conceptual part of the report, discuss what do we mean, what these regional pioneers, essentially what we mean is firms who are engaging across borders in South Asia. That's we call them regional pioneers. As Amitendu said, there's not much of investment-like activity that has taken place in the region. And finally, we'll briefly talk about some policy implications, both not only for policymakers, but even how should firms be thinking about foreign investment. And we'll just have a brief part on conclusions. Okay, so let me start with the context, approach, and the key findings. Now, all of you already know, Amitendu already talked about this, that the context of intra-regional engagement we know is low. We know that it's terribly behind potential, right? So, and it hurts consumers, it hurts workers, it hurts exporters, it hurts all economic actors in the region by the intra-regional economic engagement being low and below potential. And a previous report in the same series where we talked about trade, glass half full, that report went into detail on those aspects. But there is fresh hope. And in this current context, if there is something good that came out of COVID from a regional engagement point of view, it is that regional integration is likely to have become even more compelling because of all the issues with supply chains, the rising trade costs, especially intercontinental trade costs, rising air transport costs, and so on, and the fact that the region is likely to provide more buoyancy than ever before, now that it started recovering from the pandemic. So there is fresh hope on regional integration. Intra-regional FDI is rising, but it's still very small, right? So if you look at outward investment from South Asia, it's 2.7%, right? And if you look at inward investment, it's only 0.6% of total inward FDI, right? Is in South Asia, is within South Asia. Finally, we do want to, this slide I want to end by saying that intra-regional exports actually have started expanding recently. And they're actually amounting to almost 8% of total exports from the region, right? So this is, I think, 2018 or 2019 data. Okay. Now, there are two fundamental concepts we bring into this, which we've colored in red, which are the additional contributions of this report, right? So in terms of connectivity, we always talk about transport connectivity, trade costs. We have lot more emphasis on digital connectivity, but now also knowledge connectivity is something that we bring in a big way. In terms of international engagement, we have brought in outward FDI lens very strongly in this report. So summarizing some of the key, and I will go into these in more detail, but I want to summarize and start with some of the headlines of the report, right? So what's the bottom line? What's the characteristics of successful outward investors? So there are many opportunities and many paths in South Asia. This has become clear from the detailed case studies that we have done and the more than 1,200 surveys that we have recorded for this study. And we want to stress that outward investment is an integral component of international engagement, just like exports, just like non-equity investment, just like trade supporting investment, outward or inward FDI, or imports. So OFDI should be looked at as part of that overall picture of international engagement. Now, if you look at the foreign investment regimes of South Asia, they're improving, but the outward foreign investment regimes are still very constraining, and I'll get to that. Right? Knowledge connectivity, networks, and bilateral trust is very low in South Asia. It's also polarized between different bilateral countries. Now, those who do manage to successfully invest across borders, whom we call regional pioneers, they tend to be large firms, high productivity firms, and they tend to invest nearby. That's an interesting fact, which we'll play upon a lot. They also tend to have a well-connected founder CEO with a risk appetite, well-connected in the region, right, in South Asia. And they also invest where the bilateral communication costs are lower. Investment also tends to be incremental. So with knowledge gained in previous cross-border engagements, leading to bigger commitments. So, for example, exporting is a big way in which firms gain knowledge, right? And then that often leads to the next stage of engagement, which is some kind of investment. And therefore, we think that interventions in some of these areas will expand opportunities for South Asia. Okay, so let me talk briefly now about the outward investment regimes, which I'm sure, especially my fellow panelists would like to, will be talking about quite a bit. So what are they? A bird's eye view of investment regimes in South Asia. Now, first, in terms of recipients of investment from South Asian countries, the two biggest countries are Sri Lanka at the bottom of that graph, and then the next one is Bangladesh. Right? These are the two biggest countries as recipients. 50% of South Asian outward investment, and of course, most people would know that the bulk of this outward investment is going out from India. The bulk of this investment goes to investment hubs mostly because of preferential treatment of taxes, but also because of the role of other investment hubs, right? Especially Singapore. So 50% goes to places like Singapore, Mauritius, UAE, and Hong Kong, SAR China. If you look at the investment regimes themselves, they are very restrictive by and large. At least in the case of Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal, they're extremely restrictive. There's been a slight modification, slight improvement in Bangladesh in recent years, but still remains case by case and very restrictive. In Afghanistan, Maldives, and Pakistan, the regimes lack transparency. So although it is allowed outward investment, but it's not very clear how a particular proposal might be treated. And then there is the automatic approval route, which is India and Sri Lanka. So these are the most forward-looking investment policies, outward investment policies. However, there is also a caveat in terms of India has some region-specific policies on both outward and inward investment. On inward investment, India has some rules about any country that shares a border with India has to go through the non-automatic route. It has to go through approvals. And similarly, in terms of outward investment, if it is investing, if India is investing, Indian firms want to invest, in particular in Pakistan, it has to go through the screening process. And that's in certain cases, that's also reciprocal, as in the case of Pakistan. But there are far bigger issues on FDI, which I'll come to now, which is this issue of bilateral knowledge, connectivity, and trust, which we believe is one of the major contributions of this report. We surveyed 1,274 firms, thanks to our network of think tanks in the region. We collected data from every single country. Now, if you look at this bilateral knowledge connectivity score, the graphs are by destination. They are mapped by destination, right? So if you look at, you pick up a graph, let's say the Maldives, right? So in the case of the Maldives, which is labeled as F, okay, you find something, the Indian bar as orange. That means, on average, Indian firms know less of the Maldives than they know about other investment destinations, right? Similarly, for Bhutan, Sri Lankan firms know less about Bhutan than they know about other investment destinations, and so on, right? So this is about how well do you know, the question was, how well do you know investment opportunities abroad? And in the case of India as a host, you can see all the lines are green. That means India is average or above average for all other investors in the region. Now, the knowledge connectivity to bilateral trust nexus, right? So we had a similar. what I mentioned to you was so the first chart was, so I skipped. I don't know, this thing is jumping. The slides are jumping a bit. Can we go back to the previous one, Kuntavi? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this one is talking about knowledge of investors. How well do you know about the opportunities abroad, right? And if you go to the next one, that one talks about trust, right? So, how much trust do you have in people from various South Asian countries, right? So similarly, it's also ranked by destination. And then we compiled the two together. And the question was, the knowledge connectivity to trust nexus appears to be pretty significant, right? So we are raising is, to know me, is it the same as trusting me, right? So we find a very strong, a very close correlation between the bilateral knowledge score between countries and the bilateral trust score between countries. And this has important policy implications for the region. Right. So, and I come to the next part, which is the conceptual framework. And I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but I will just mention briefly that we have, this is obviously at the conceptual framework that we develop is taken, the heart of this is the firm. We look at all activities along the value chain of a firm, and we look at the things that are important are location and ownership for all the chain activities. Right? So, and a key concept that we bring in is the concept of sunk entry costs, right? So here it is, sunk entry costs are anything that when a firm goes in for the first time into any new destination, there are all kinds of fixed and sunk entry costs that it must spend on getting to know the destination, marketing and distribution, finding distributors, all of that, right? So it's part of sunk entry costs, and the what we have put out, posited that the entry cost, the F of export, the sunk entry cost of exports is less than the sunk entry cost of trade supporting FDI, which in turn is less than the sunk entry cost of fixed of foreign direct investment in production, right? And we talk about all kinds of corporate strategies for investing, ranging from just plain simple relational contracting, brand investing, different asset light approaches, all the way to a fixed production investment. And we draw on that a lot in the report and in the econometric analysis as well. Okay. So what are the key features of these regional pioneers, right? So the investing, the sectors where pioneers originate from are very wide ranging. They range from manufacturing to wholesale retail trade, to transportation, to storage, and so on. And the sectors where they invest in are also very wide ranging, right? They traverse the whole gamut of sectors, but there is a strong focus there on lower value investments, especially on the service side, on the trade supporting side. And I'm just highlighting two investments out of the many that we studied. We did, as I said, 11 detailed case studies for this report, which are detailed in the book itself. But I want to just highlight two of them. One is Surti Enterprises from Pakistan, which started with distribution investment in Bangladesh. It wanted to market its fabric, very good producer of denim fabrics. And then given the security situation in Pakistan in those years, this I'm talking, decades ago, I think it was in the 90s. And then starting from there, it helped it to connect to global buyers. And then it went on to production investment in the Comilla export processing zone 3 years later, right? And now it is a successful global exporter and part of value chains in the US and Europe and so on. A very different kind of investment was a joint venture, started off with a Taj Hotels investment in Sri Lanka, Taj of India, but then Taj, because of the civil war, etc., they were having financial issues, And so CG Hospitality of Nepal, of the Chaudhary Group, they came and became a joint venture partner. They invested fresh capital. And so this became a joint venture with CG and Taj, with management supplied by Taj as the hotelier from India. So this has gone and become bigger and much more successful for both companies, gone on to Maldives and Sri Lanka, and CG itself has grown from strength to strength as a result of this. Okay. As I said, we had, we did also very detailed econometric exercises. We tested many hypotheses econometrically, about 1,274 firms. What are some of the key results that we came out with, right? So investors tend to follow a gradualist path, right? There are a few obviously with big pockets and big purses, but even they tend to start gradually testing the waters. They are often exporters. They start with exporting, they learn about the destination, and then they get into investment. They're often part of a conglomerate. So if one part of a conglomerate has invested, then another part of the conglomerate tends to invest in the same destination. And often the founder or CEO has a big risk appetite or is a part of a well-known business community or a family, and therefore they have links in these other countries overseas. In the neighboring countries. And therefore, these are the kind of firms that tend to do cross-border investments in South Asia. And the knowledge diffusion, which I've emphasized a few times, the knowledge diffusion, which is critical for having the confidence to invest in another country, whether it is near you or far away from you. How do firms learn best? And as already mentioned, this chart is basically showing you that the lowest fixed cost entry cost is in exports, and the highest is in foreign investment in production. In between, you have different grades of. So this is a rising fixed cost of entry as you go from left to right in this arrow. So the biggest drop in fixed cost comes from your own learning experience from exports, right? So if you are a firm that has already exported earlier let's say if you're a Sri Lankan firm, which has exported previously to India, then that gives you a lot of confidence in the next round that actually I will then go and invest in production in India as a Sri Lankan firm. And there are actual case studies of this in our report. But in general, knowledge diffusion from pioneering firms is a bit sticky. And we call this the lack of a herd effect. There is not easy. Let's say if some big world-class firm, global firm, or a local firm, let's say, again, a Sri Lankan firm invests in India, you would expect that other firms in that same industry would follow, right? Because some knowledge is being transmitted by the fact that a Mass or a Brandix or a Damro has gone into India. But that herd effect has not taken place in South Asia. And that's one of the policy implications of the report, how we can change that. Okay, so here, let me come to that part now. So, for firms, we've seen that there are many opportunities, there are many paths. One of our investors said to us that you can start small, but you learn big, right? This is the whole point of incremental learning. And you can even start, as one of the case studies showed, you can start from outside, right? You, like CG Hospitality, they started that venture, hospitality, the entire business of hotels and hospitality started in Sri Lanka. But then they applied the learnings back home to Nepal, right? So what we have learned is the importance of investment in knowledge connectivity, a deliberate investment, and there is a role for many interconglomerate knowledge sharing, investment intermediaries, and so on. And I know many of you will be interested in this aspect of it, which is the policy side. Okay, so we have, I guess you can say, 5 buckets, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will speak to this. But the big areas are knowledge connectivity, and we should not downplay this, right? I don't think this has really been emphasized. We always talk about trade costs and reduction and tariffs and so on. But here our report makes a big deal with evidence of knowledge connectivity and development of networks for giving firms that confidence to invest across borders. And there are various ways to improve knowledge connectivity. So, so these are low cost interventions, mind you. We're not talking of fiscal incentives and, percentages of GDP. We're talking of, incremental investments by government in information, dissemination, studied matchmaking events, and so on. A policy aspect which is very important is deregulating outward investment policies, right? This is, policymakers need to understand that outward investment, OFDI, is as much a part of international engagement, is as much part of firm resilience and competitiveness as inward investment, right? So we are now in a globalized world. So there are things that a firm learns from outward investment, right? So we have a whole litany of gains from outward investment for those, for the policymakers more interested. But I think this is an anachronism, the restrictions on outward investment. And I think, we think, my co-authors and I think that this is something that South Asian countries where restrictions still exist would do well to get rid of quickly. At least announce an intention to look at those kinds of policies. Reduce inward FDI costs, do smart inward FDI policies by attracting investors that are already in the South Asian region. For example, they're already there in India, grab hold of them, for investing, coming into your own country, smaller countries in the region. And then there are the institutional aspects of outward and inward investment promotion. And we also continue to emphasize the importance of digital connectivity, especially in a post-pandemic world. Right? So finally, let me conclude by just reiterating a couple of points. One, we talked, as Amitendu also said, there is a huge welfare loss from inadequate intra-regional economic cooperation. Now we have even more compelling reasons to engage with the COVID-19 having accelerating earlier trends to value chain diversification, nearshoring. There is decline in air transport capacity, intercontinental, and there are huge increase in trade costs. So this gives an impetus for regional engagement. And there is a promise in the regional pioneer story, right? With 65% of first investments, at least by numbers, not by value, mind you. It is purely based on number of investments are within the region, and that's based on the approach of cautious and incremental outward engagement. And this is something that the policymakers have a base. They can encourage this to get closer to a so-called herd effect. And as I said, policy suggestions are very light on fiscally and demand smart policy and sensible policy reorientation. And I think we have big opportunities in the region for regional and global value chains arising from these kinds of suggestions. So thank you, Amitendu. I will stop.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. That was wonderful. And I really think that this is an aspect of South Asia's economic story, which really deserved the kind of in-depth attention that you have given to it along with your co-authors. And I do hope that the findings that you reflected in your conclusions resonate with the policymakers in the region, because very often there is a sense within South Asia that in order to increase the region's economic capacities and performance, it is important to go out of the region. Other than that, there is not really much hope in the prospects that South Asia might have. But I think what your work brings to focus is the very important realization that a lot can be achieved if South Asian stakeholders, businesses, policymakers, and the rest of the important economic and business communities talk much more and engage much more with each other within the region, rather than trying to just step out of the region on the assumption that not much is expected to happen out of the conversation and time and resources spent in engaging with the neighbors. I think that's a very important takeaway for me. And I'll obviously want to come back to you with a few more thoughts on my mind, which I would like to bounce up with you. But before that, we today have an absolutely excellent and brilliant panel of discussions with us today. And some of them, like Sanjay, are also closely associated with ISAS, including being from ISAS. So Professor Ganesh Vignaraja, Dr. Nishchal Pandey, Dr. Masudur Rahman. We have them along with Dr. Sajid and of course, Dr. Dil Bahadur Rahut. So what I would like to do is go in the reverse order in which we have placed the panelists in the discussion note for the program today. This is not with any particular intention, but I think it might be good to just step into the Indian Ocean geographically, start from a country which arguably has always been the most progressive, forward-looking and outward-oriented economy in the region, that is Sri Lanka, and come to the discussion from a Sri Lankan perspective with Dr. Ganesh Vignaraja. So Ganesh, the floor is all yours for your perspective. 5 minutes for you, as with all our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amitendu, and it was a very interesting presentation. I'm going to try to cluster my comments on 3 issues. I'm going to provide a few thoughts on the findings of the book. Then I'm going to talk about the recovery from the pandemic and the implications for intra-regional FDI. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a bit about intra-regional FDI involving Sri Lanka. On the first topic of the book, so South Asia, as we all know, has been a story of low intra-regional trade. And, you know, many of the factors were discussed about barriers to such trade, trust deficit between the big players in the region. And also another unexplored issue is the similarity in factor endowments, that countries are very similar in what they produce rather than being different. Now, Sanjay's book and his co-authors really looks at this topic through intra-regional FDI. And we have to really appreciate the difficult exercise that he has done because data on intra-regional FDI is lacking. I mean, there are very few good databases, and even something like FDI markets only looks at greenfield investments. So Sanjay, you know, and take this innovative approach by looking at firms and also policy environment. So you know, you deserve our thanks for that, Sanjay. Wonderfully done. And the findings are there are lots of constraints as we think, investment regimes and local knowledge. There are these investment pioneers which have certain characteristics. And then he recommends, you know, opening up in smaller economies, even involving smaller economies, and promoting digitization and so on. And you know, all very useful. Thank you, Sanjay. On my second set of issues around the recovery from the pandemic, it's my assertion, and one stylizes it for the few minutes we have, that South Asia really faces this 2-speed recovery from the pandemic, and this has implications for intra-regional FDI. And as you know, everyone knows here, institutions are predicting a V-shaped recovery, albeit a moderation from the pandemic, partly linked to this kind of base effect and vaccination rates. And we talked about Bhutan earlier. Now, ADB talks about a 7% growth rate for South Asia in 2022, slightly down from the giddy 9% people talked about in 2021. Now, a lot of that is India, right? And Amitendu talked about the pandemic. And, you know, this is probably going to be a big unknown as we go forward. Now, there is a tacit assumption in all of this is that FDI will follow growth. But I think it's going to be a 2-stage process. India and Bangladesh may be attracted to global and regional FDI, and FDI from India to Bangladesh could increase. But due to difficult geography and macro conditions, the rest of South Asia risks being marginalized in this story of possibly rising FDI flows. For instance, the smaller countries such as Bhutan and Nepal may have little prospect of joining regional supply trade. I mean, even as services providers, because their trade costs are just too high, and this is linked to geography. This is the classic small states argument made by the Commonwealth and others. So that's one issue. And then we have Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which have macroeconomic imbalances and external debt problems, which are less attractive to intra-regional FDI, especially in COVID times. And Pakistan has this specific problem because of the difficulties with India, is missing out on the biggest source of FDI in South Asia, right? So that is a particular thing. Of course, China is filling the breach in those two countries in particular, and so that's an interesting story. So my main point is that alongside trying to promote FDI, the rest of South Asia must look at promoting domestic firms, particularly the large firms, as well as diaspora investors as means to drive exports and growth. So the questions from the inter-regional panel: is this a two-spade recovery in FDI? Is it unfolding? And what are the right policies to encourage domestic firms and diaspora investors? So that's a set of questions. Briefly, lastly, on Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka is an interesting case, as Amitendu said, the earliest outward-oriented economy in South Asia. And India-Sri Lanka FDI is one of the shining thoughts. And Sanjay talked a bit about that Taj investing in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka has actually sought a broader set of opportunities from India. And Indians have come in construction, in tourism, IT, finance, a little bit of industry. And, the outward-oriented policies of Sri Lanka, the proximity to India, Sri Lanka's tourism assets, the FTA between India and Sri Lanka, often cited as reasons. But India is not really the largest investor in Sri Lanka. So this is well below potential. The numbers are very small still. And, there's been very little proactive marketing of FDI attraction from India by Sri Lanka. We have cumbersome regulations. There's a trust deficit even in the business community. So a lot of issues are there. Now, Sri Lanka hopes that this port city, Colombo Port City, built on reclaimed land from the sea, will be a game changer to attract Indian investment in leisure as well as in professional and financial services. So the big question is really, what would it take for the Colombo CPC SEZ, because there are lots of tax incentives to attract Indian and even Pakistani investors? And that's a question for the panel. The final thought on Sri Lanka is really that Sri Lanka is also an outward investor in Bangladesh, which is an interesting news story. So inter-regional investment in South Asia is not just an India story, as Sanjay alluded to. So garment firms in Sri Lanka have become involved in the garment sector in Bangladesh. It seems like a one-way flow from Sri Lanka to Bangladesh rather than the other way around, but it's early days. And this is kind of further evidence of the so-called third world multinational thesis pioneered by the late Sanjay Lal, which talked about Indian multinationals going out and them having some of the characteristics of large investors. And I'd be curious on Sanjay's take on that theory of third world multinationals by Sanjay Lal, whether how much applicable that is to his own work. Now, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh is driven by low wages, which I think Sanjay hasn't emphasized enough, perhaps, in his presentation, relative to productivity. Firm strategies, and then the linkages of Sri Lankan managers and technical workers. And then there's a big phenomenon recently, which comes to the crisis of Sri Lankan firms looking to outward opportunities because of the dollar shortage and the exchange control problem in Sri Lanka, which links to the unfolding debt problem. So interestingly, how this is driving a new wave of Sri Lankan outward investment. So lastly, some questions for the panel. First, is this a two-stage scenario unfolding? And are we worrying about marginalization of non-Bangladesh and India in this inter-regional story? What are the right policies to attract domestic firms to become game changers in South Asia? and diaspora investors, which again deserves a separate topic from ISAS. And then what kind of political economy lens needs to be applied to looking at non-Indian interregional FDI, and what kind of regional FDI regime needs to be there in South Asia? And that regional dimension was kind of neglected by Sanjay somewhat in the conversation. So many issues. I'm sorry, Amitendu, if I've gone too much.
No, Ganesh, you have not. And as always, those were very illuminating insights, and a pleasure to hear you. And of course, we are going to come back to you again. And I think Sanjay will be very much keen on responding to some of the thoughts that you shared, particularly the third world multilateralism issue. With that, let me now come to our next panelist in the order that we are following, Dr. Sajid, Amin, Javed. Dr. Javed, the floor is yours, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me join Ganeshan in thanking Dr. Sanjay for bringing such an excellent report, particularly taking, moving the discussion from regional trade to regional investments. This, as you also said in your introduction, this is the least explored topic in itself. Leave aside the amount of investments, intra-regional investments. The topic is, the discussion in South Asia is mainly on the regional trade. It's less has been talked on regional investment. And I think this is one of the biggest services that this report is doing, that at least this is bringing in the discussion. As I have just 5 minutes, so I'll just take 2 points on particularly in terms of a forward-looking context, that how these two at least important kind of structural changes can help sort of change the pattern of low intra-regional trade, and particularly on the investments. The one I think Sanjay has already highlighted at good details, and that is the COVID-19 led kind of as a strong economic case, strong economic integration, or the regional integration case. And I think one point that can be further explored, and I think this is an opportunity, is the digitalization that is coming along with the COVID-19. And if we kind of see it in context of services trade, because one thing that I think COVID-19 has catalyzed is that it has made services more tradable than goods. And I think this is in context of Pakistan particularly is important, given the kind of the cross-border issues with India and Bangladesh, two of the very kind of progressive rising economies. So I think the barriers of investment in goods may be still sort of persisting there, but I think it can be a good option to explore the investments in the services, because many of the trade barriers, many of the cross-border mobility and other barriers are not that strong when it is the investments in the services sector. And I think Sanjay has very rightly highlighted in his book that South Asia has a very growing services sector now. So I think this can be one possible area to explore, because it has less barriers than the investments and trade sector. So services sector, I think, when kind of coupled with the digitalization and the modes of remote working and many other areas coming because of COVID-19, offers a good opportunity, I think, moving forward. So that is one, that tapping the large services sector in the region to promote intra-regional investments can be a good starting point. This is the one. And the second point that I think was slightly maybe sort of less explored, and that is where the South Asia is also, witnessing a changing production and export structures in the regional countries, for example. If you go 10 to 15 years back, we have competing production structures, competing export structures. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all on cotton, textile, and steel. But now I think there is a kind of a hierarchy coming on in terms of product exports and the production exports, the production of goods. For example, if we see the major exports of India in the last year, that is engineering goods, petroleum products, organic and inorganic chemicals, drugs and pharmaceuticals, electronic goods. But if you see the same in the Pakistan, that is the textiles and warm clothing, cotton, knitted clothing accessories, and cereals. So I think this changing production structure across the regional countries also provide an opportunity. And I think this is one factor that Sanjay has also highlighted, that there was a sort of, though very small, still 8% of the total exports of intra-regional exports, but there is a growth. And I think this one growth in intra-regional exports is coming from these changing production structures. So I think moving forward, this provides an opportunity to see also. The last point I think is on this one. The production costs also vary across country to country now, for example. And the one point that highlighted by Sanjay is that the COVID actually compelled to integrate because the intercontinental trade and other costs were increasing. I think this is also a good sign, but this is a worrying sign as well, because this kind of integration is a forced integration, I think. How sustainable it is, that will be very critical to see that how we, and this is where Sanjay's point, I think, on the trust gap. To me, the key point of this one takeaway, if I'm asked to take one takeaway from this book as a building block to promote intra-regional trust, that is the intra-regional trust gap, actually. And I think I'll see that there will be very critical role of even more than policymakers. I think the private sectors and the civil society organization and the think tanks, how they come up with the kind of proposals, solutions, voices, forums, promote that trust gap. For example, the example coming from the book is that one Pakistani pioneer firm going to Bangladesh for the investment. And you see the level of integration is so large that this is called historic investment. It should have come very early. Actually, it's coming very late still, but it is good to see. But I think one reason for that was the higher cost of production in Pakistan. The utility bills were increasing so highly, actually. But this is good to see that. So I see the two very important factors coming. The one is the COVID-19 led services being more tradable, and the changing production structures and skills levels that also generation also that, and that this is pushing Pakistani firms to move to at least to willing to move, intending to move towards Bangladesh. And I think the trust with cross-border investments in India, that will be also the critical to moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Javed. Those were very deep thoughts, I felt, because when it comes to the question of capital, trade, and for that matter, any business engagement within the region, I think the issue of trust is absolutely fundamental, and that unfortunately is something which has not been available in abundance within the region. And I think what Sanjay alluded to in terms of the knowledge trust nexus in his work is something which needs to be looked at very, very seriously as we go ahead with the content of the findings from this exercise. Let me now have the pleasure of calling on Dr. Nishchal Nath Pandey, Director, Center for South Asian Studies, an old friend of ISA's, a very, very prominent voice, not just on Nepal, but also on South Asia and the regional issues at large. Dr. Pandey, can we have your thoughts for the next 5 minutes, please?
Thank you, Dr. Amitendu Palit. So nice to see all of you. Congratulations on my behalf also to Dr. Sanjay for this excellent publication. And we've heard about low level of trade investment in our region. We have heard about low level of cross-border mobility in our region. It is cheaper to countries to trade with outside countries than within the region. An example is my own country, Nepal itself. You know, we have received foreign investment from 52 countries in 2020. India ranked top with 62.45 billion rupees, followed by China. But the third country, very interesting, is St. Kitts and Nevis in the Caribbean, which invested the most amount. So that also shows the predicament in South Asia, where the low level of knowledge sharing and investment coming in from our own neighbors has been really a story to tell. Dr. Palit mentioned about South Asia story. And what struck me was that if you see the old short story written by Rabindranath Tagore, Kabuliwala, he talks about a merchant coming from Kabul, Afghanistan, to sell his dry fruits all the way to Calcutta and then returns back. Now, is that even thinkable in 2022? A merchant coming from Afghanistan and selling his goods in Calcutta and returning back. If you go even in historic times, the world's largest religious gathering is the Mahakumbha or the Kumbh Mela, celebrated in a cycle of approximately 12 years, when Jupiter makes a revolution, exact one revolution, and completes this celebration is done exactly on the same date at 4 river banks in India. And thousands of Nepalese visit the Kumbh Mela. And they have been doing so from the past hundreds and hundreds of years. So even before the advent or the start of the modern day calendar, how was it possible for South Asians to congregate in particular places in India hundreds of years ago? So I think the mobility, connectivity, and knowledge sharing in the historic times was much better than post 1947. And that leads us to the discussion that look at the story of, I'm so happy that the CG hospitality was mentioned of our prominent industrialist Vinod Chaudhary, not only in the hotel sector, but Dr. Sanjay, he has also invested the YY noodles and is doing very well in India. We have spoken, we should also look into Ram Bhandar, the sweet shop in Varanasi, how it has invested in other countries. We've had property in Varanasi and Allahabad and Lucknow of Nepalese in the historic times. And even today, there are some litigations going on about Nepalese citizens owning property in India. And all this was possible because of connectivity, easy connectivity, which we destroyed post-1947. I think this needs to be revisited. There is now better connectivity in North India. I'm talking about this particular landmass. Jogbani is a border town in Nepal-Bihar border. It is now well connected with Anand Vihar station in New Delhi. You can take a train from Jogbani and within 9 hours, you'll reach New Delhi today. Now, this was unthinkable just about a decade ago. UP is very well connected with Nepal. I mean, you can take a train and go to any part of India from our Uttarakhand and UP borders. There are better roads, thanks to good governance done by all these chief ministers in North India. However, remittance is falling, and this is the COVID tragedy. Remittance has fallen by 7.3% this year, as far as Nepal is concerned. Tourism is virtually nil for an economy like us. You know, remittance and tourism is the most important features of our economy. Remittance contributes about 28% of our GDP. Now, so therefore, talking about knowledge connectivity also, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, South Asians used to look upon Lucknow, Allahabad, Banaras Hindu University, Delhi University, Jawaharlal Nehru University as their first prime destination of education, which has now completely changed. They are more, interested to go to Australia, United States, Europe for their studies. And this is going to change the knowledge connectivity we used to have in our region. And all this is going to impact on our investment. All this is going to impact on the nature of business connectivity among businessmen. If you look at the Chaudharys, the Khetans, Agrawals of our region who have come from India to Nepal and from Nepal to other countries in the region, all of them have come here because of easy connectivity, 3 generations ago. But that is going to change because they are now going into Singapore, Australia, United States, EU, and that is going to change our dynamics also. Dr. Palit, I can go on, but thank you so much for this publication. I really look forward to receiving the hard copy or at least the soft copy of the publication so that we can go through it in detail. Congratulations again, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey, as always. In fact, I completely agree with you, and I want to also express this wish that this is a publication which really deserves to be taken to the far-flung corners of the region as much as possible and be discussed as much within the think tank, academic, policymaker, business communities, because there are, I mean, to me, the most important part of this publication is that it's a positive and hopeful publication. It's an optimistic publication. And I think at this point in time, South Asia does need a lot of hope and optimism. So I hope in the presence of stalwarts and experts like you, Ganesh, and the others that we have with us today, we'll get many more opportunities to discuss this report and its contents threadbare. With that now, I'm very happy to invite Dr. Dil Bahadur Rahut to share his thoughts. Dr. Rahut is from Bhutan, though today he's a professional with the Asian Development Bank Institute at Tokyo. And I'm particularly happy because Bhutan is a country from whom we really tend to get a perspective on a large number of regional issues which are of tremendous importance. So Dil, my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion today. And I now offer you your 5 minutes for sharing your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Amitendu Palit. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in this forum and to discuss this book. Congratulations, Dr. Sanjay. It's great reading, going through your book. I really went through it and found it very, very interesting. I think this is very, very timely that you brought this book out when our regions is really is going apart. We really need to come together and look at the problems and solutions together. I think that's where we are missing, and I think this book is the starting point. And moving forward, we have to really come together and bring such kind of books on different issues so that we are more integrated. As others have pointed out, that we are actually looking very far for trades, for FDI, and for solutions rather than looking within the regions. I think looking at the cost of doing the business, I think the regional trade and regional integration would be very, very important. However, I mean, the transaction cost of doing business and investments and trade within the region is very, very high. So I think that's the reason why we are always looking outside. As Dr. Sanjay has rightly pointed out, three things: the knowledge, trust, and openness. I think these are the three major problems that we see in the regions, in the sense that we don't want to know more about each other's, what are the opportunity. Whenever we think of anything, we always think of outside the regions. And second thing is that we are not open to each other. I think it's very, very important that we open up ourselves, we open up ourselves for the neighbors to do business. And the trust, I think that's very, very important. There's trust has really, really gone down in the regions. As Dr. Pandey has pointed out, from Kabuliwala time, where they, we could imagine people from somebody from Kabul coming and doing a trade. So that thing has really gone away. So it's very important that as a region we stand together, build trust, and try to work together. Some of the institutions that we have initiated in the regions have proven that we cannot work together. I worked for South Asian University for some time, and it was a very good initiative with lots of good intentions. And I've seen that, how it fizzled out over a period of time, and many such institutions have failed. I think it's pity. So it's very important to build trust. But one of the things that our book, the book by Sanjay misses, as Ganesh pointed out, the political economy aspect, So I think that's something that's missing in the book. book. And from Bhutan perspective, we're a small country with almost like less than 1 million populations. But we had close interactions with India. There has been lots of investment from Indian side, but mostly government-backed investment in power sectors, but nothing beyond that. So we have not seen that. Although we have been interacting very closely with Bangladesh, we have been trying to do lots of trade, but then there's not much investment. And Bhutan always looks forward to stronger collaboration with Bangladesh. At some point of time, we had some trades around on agricultures and garment sectors, which also is not going that well. So somehow I think that's very important. And I don't know if Amitendu, you remember at one point of time when Dr. Rajiv Kumar was the director at ITREAR and Pranab Mukherjee was the foreign minister, we had a big conference in Guwahati, and where we talked about sub-regional cooperations, where is it possible for Bhutan, Bengal, West Bengal, Bangladesh, Assam, and Nepal, Sikkim really to work together, because we are so close to each other, and there's so much of potential. We have the resources, and there's an intent. Maybe there's an intent from the people side. The business, they want to do trade. So somehow I always think that has been always at the back of my mind. Is it possible that we make a sub-regional corporations and try to come together, make an investment, make trades? So that's something that I always look forward to. But then I think India has to take a leadership in this regional trades and regional investment, and I think others will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Dil. Very interesting thoughts, and thank you so much for drawing our attention again to the issue of sub-regional cooperation. And I think what you also recalled, the occasion of a large number of investors from the region coming together to discuss issues which would facilitate investment in the region, but more importantly, such kind of discussions on the sidelines and within themselves also have the great opportunity for building familiarity and creating more trust. I think that eventually becomes the bottom line of a lot of things that we are discussing here today. So with that noted, let me now turn to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Masudur Rahman from Institute of South Asian Studies. Masood, the floor is yours for the next 5 minutes for your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amitendu, and congratulations, Sanjay and his team for this excellent book. And I think the very important things that Sanjay bring out in this book, one is called outward FDI arrangement. That is very important things. And because I'll talk about on that issues and Bangladesh perspective. The three important issues that Sanjay tried to bring, one is knowledge connectivity and outward FDI arrangement, and of course the trade and investment nexus. That is, we talk about always. But particularly in Bangladesh perspective, so both FDI inflow and outflow is important. But last maybe 2 decades, Bangladesh trying to bring FDI inflow always. So that is the most important things every country try, particularly developing countries. They need money, they need investment. So they try to, they try to organize different types of policy institutions and try to attract FDI. But you see in Bangladesh, last 2 decades, the average FDI net inflow every year is like $1.5 to $2 billion every year, which is, compared to the remittance, which is much lower, because remittance we receive every month around $2 billion, $1.5 to $2 billion. So, and we have Bangladesh Investment Development Board, we have export processing zone, we have special economic zone, we have one-stop service. So many different types of rules, regulation, and institution to attract FDI. But still, this FDI is less than 1% of GDP. So there are some issues is there. Of course, the connectivity, knowledge gap, all these things is there. In addition, maybe low confidence in good governance, quality infrastructure, market, even the market size is in a very good market size, but this kinds of soft issues, that has been vital to, attack FDI. And the other issues, because Bangladesh is going to, graduate from LDC category by 2026, and Bangladesh has huge external debt, like $40 billion. So FDI is critical to get, from this, because you have to pay high interest rate. Now we are Bangladesh enjoying concession loan. So after graduation, maybe FDI will be more important. So from that perspective, Bangladesh is trying to attract different types of, FDI and, the investment. But the second things that I wanted to discuss, basically, that how Bangladesh doing outward FDI arrangement. That is the main point that Sanjay and his team try to discuss. Yes, Bangladesh actually has been very restricted policy on outward FDI arrangement until 2015, because the main the documents is Foreign Exchange Regulation Act 1947. That was the main, the regulation that, the restricted outward FDI and investment to other country. But in 2015 and 2022, that is I think maybe Sanjay maybe skip this, the new rules. Overseas Equity Investment Act 2020. So the last, so 2020, they have drafted these rules. Under these rules, Bangladesh government, the central bank allow investing to overseas. So under this, the revised rules, now central bank allow 15 firms investing in outside, particularly 3 pharmaceutical company, Square investing $20 million in Kenya, ACI investing $100 million in USA, but Incepta investing in UK. Vaccine pharmaceutical company got approval from the central bank to invest in Sri Lanka, but finally they did not make it. And some other company like BCRN, steel company, they invest in Kenya. So this is a huge investment. Akis Group is one other company, they're investing in Malaysia. They bought 2 companies in Malaysia and they're doing very well. Some other company like DBL, they invested it in Ethiopia, because the mind of this, that Bangladesh is going to graduate from LDC, and they need to free access to USA market, particularly because under AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, African country enjoy duty-free to export to USA. So this, Hamim Group also try to invest in Haiti. So this, make a huge, shift from Bangladesh, restricted, outward FDI policy to liberalized FDI policy. Even in South Asia, Pran is one of the, leading Bangladeshi company. Rima Afroj and Bangladeshi company, who are actually selling battery, Pran selling the food product, they are investing in India. So recently, the overall, because of Bangladesh understand they have been stuck with the attacking FDI over the years, and now they're trying to liberalize their outward FDI policy and try to give because we have some very good company, very good firm, they have a huge capacity to invest outside. And Bangladesh also has a handsome amount of foreign reserve. So the government is allowing this firm to invest outside. So I think it's a major shift, from liberalized outward FDI policy to investing outside Bangladeshi firm. But there are some limitation of this, and there are some policies guidelines there. For example, now they have some investment ceiling, like this company can invest 20% of their export earnings, last 5 years export earnings, overseas, or 25% of their net asset, and also there are some kinds of regulation is there, like they have to use 30% of Bangladeshi management or labor in this foreign, overseas firm. So, but yeah, with this, but it's a good initiative by the government that they are liberalizing their outward investment policy. So with this note, I'll stop here. And then I have one just question to Sanjay, that if you see Bangladesh, and from Bangladesh perspective, most of the company, they are investing not in neighboring country, they're investing to far, Africa and some other country where they think they can make money. So how do you think there is a knowledge gap here? So is this a reality? So that is my question, then I will come back later if Amitendu give me some floor.
Thank you, Masood. In fact, I personally feel that when we look at the prospects of outward FDI from South Asia, and we really tend to revisit the earlier notion that we had of certain countries of the world being exporters of capital as such. And we have always tended to pinpoint those countries as the sources of capital for a region like South Asia. But today within South Asia, the dynamics have changed. And it is not just India, it is Bangladesh, Pakistan, and also businesses from Sri Lanka and Nepal who are beginning to demonstrate the fact that they are very much in a position to export capital, not just within the region, but outside of it, in order to take advantage of the economic opportunities that are presenting themselves. So thank you for bringing that realization back to us in the space of this discussion. What I would like to do now is that I realize that we have just about 30 minutes left for us in this program, including the discussion. Now, I would like to request Sanjay to take the floor now with two specific ideas. The first is, Sanjay, that if you would want to reflect a little bit of the Indian perspective that you might have in the exercise that you have crafted and the findings that you have obtained in that regard, very briefly, just what might be the salient issues. And then from there onward, there are specific questions which have been raised for you. And these come first from Ganesh, then also from Dr. Dil Bahadur Rahut, and finally from Masood. And we also had Nishchal raising some interesting points along with Dr. Sajid. So what I'd like to do is to maybe for the next 10 minutes, if you could reflect first a little bit on what might be the Indian context. In your view, you know India better than practically all of us out here as a source of capital and an investment entity. And then respond to some of the issues and questions that have been raised. And then we can have, in the remaining time, a much more broad-based discussion. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you very much, Amitendu, and thank you to all my panelists for some excellent thoughts and comments. And I'm mindful of the time, and so I will try to be very brief because there's a lot. So I may not necessarily, forgive me if I don't come to every single point, but let me just try to do a broad brush. So one is, so starting with India, right? So India doesn't really have any issues now of, for the last several years, as it has been steadily liberalizing its capital account, doesn't really have any restrictions on outward investment in a sort of macroeconomic sense, other than what I noted with some border investment in Pakistan in particular. But other than that, there is no, which is a completely different set of issues. But other than that, there's no macro issues. But what has been an unfortunate legacy, and when I was living in Bangladesh as part of the World Bank representative, the Economist for the bank, I learned that there is it kind of came home to me that many of India's bad policies, right, the poor pre-liberalization policies, very kind of a dirigious set of policies, they had repercussions in the region. People, a lot of countries, the example in the current context is FERA, the very draconian Foreign Exchange Regulation Act of India, the 1974 Act, in a sense has been still persists. India has gone long left behind FERA, but it still persists in one way or the other in many countries. And and Masood spoke about the liberalization on the outward side, but still, I know that in many aspects, right, there are very strong regulations on the use of foreign exchange in Bangladesh, and he pointed those out too, and same in Nepal, right? So I think there is that legacy. From a regional perspective, I think that what countries in the region should really be looking to India for is a source of capital, right? India invests 10 to 15 billion, Indian companies invest 10 to 15 billion dollars overseas every year, right? And a very tiny fraction of that, less than 1% of that, if that, it's probably even much less than that. I can get you the exact figures, but a very small fraction of that goes to South Asia. So this also gets at this other question that Ganesh had about, so I'll try to, merge in the interest of time, that the issue of two-stage recovery, right? He's talking how do you, so I think part of South Asian recovery, as India is growing, but mind you, it's still below pre-pandemic level. So it's just recovering, but India will grow. It is how can the rest of South Asia become a part of Indian value chains, right? There is a massive thrust in certain manufacturing sectors, right? And the PLI scheme, the production linked incentive scheme, is only one aspect of that. There is generally, the government is at least putting a lot of emphasis on manufacturing from a labor employment point of view. So how can other countries in the region attract Indian foreign investment? I think that has to be a big question that every country must ask, right? So we have documented in the book, my good friend, the late Saman Kelegama, used to speak about this, he's written about this, that there is an issue about Indian investment not always being welcome in the neighboring countries, right? There are issues of asymmetry, about fear and all of that. But if you're welcoming capital from Japan or the United States, then why is there an asymmetric approach to investment from India? I think that is the question that someone raised, right? And I think if there is got to be this kind of a greater cohesion of value chains in South Asia, there's no getting away from India being the player which sort of coalesces those value chains in a large range of sectors, as Sajid was hinting at, and I'll come back to that. But it is not only, there are other, so Bangladesh is already coalescing, say, garments investment, right? It's coming from Sri Lanka in management, from Pakistan in yarn fabrics, from India in management and yarn and fabric, for Sri Lanka especially in capital and management, right? So there is already a value chain, at least incipient, not a huge one, but a garments regional value chain. Can we replicate that? But I think then the region must, and each policymaker, each country must be actively seeking, I think, investment from India. And India, on its part, because it wants to, the government has clearly stated, that India must also be encouraging and making it easier for its own firms, or encouraging its firms to invest in South Asia. And there, I think this whole knowledge connectivity aspect that we talked about gets very important. Now, if we agree that to know is to trust, right? And all of you talked about it, right? So Nishchal talked about it, Sajid talked about it, Dil Bahadur talked about it, right? So if you think that know is to trust, then how can we know that in some countries there has been active tourism, right? So Bangladesh, India is active, Sri Lanka, India is active in terms of tourism, Nepal, India is active. But some of the others, the facts that Ganesh was talking about, I think some of the other bilateral relationships are not that active in terms of tourism or in terms of people-to-people contact. Now, I think that is an initial step in that investment process, right? So because to know is to trust, to get to know, and you will start making those incipient investments if you have knowledge. You never know what chance meetings can do, right? We used to call the famous water cooler meetings when it comes to the office. The counterpart is that you meet somebody on a train or on the airplane, or on your tourist visit or religious visit and so on. So I think encouraging that kind of tourism, whatever it is, I think will be is a major part of also promoting investment within the region. The issue that I think several times brought up about this whole issue of third world multinationals, Ganesh talked about. So the Indian investment in the past, right? So I think often used to be about getting over domestic policy constraints, right? So a lot of investment in Thailand, Indonesia, and so on to get over issues of domestic constraints, let's say in capacity expansion, or getting a certain kind of raw materials and so on. But today, obviously, even though there is some of that still, but the most of Indian overseas investment now is much more kind of traditional frontier, often frontier investment, mergers and acquisitions, getting hold of technology of other countries, servicing markets closer to the customer, especially when you talk about services. Excuse me. In the IT sector and so on, but it's not only IT. We have had some very high-profile investments in automobiles and steel and so on. So I think they have become now global players, and I think that's why the South Asian. I would now go to the point that and reiterate the point that Sajid made, that contrary to what is sometimes said about this issue of is the production structure compatible? Is it complementary? And I agree with you totally, Sajid, that there has been growing divergence in South Asia of production structures, which makes very ripe ground for value chains, right? So, and you gave the example, so I won't repeat them, right? But I think from a production point of view, there is indeed growing complementarity, because India is not one country. There are very, very sophisticated, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Kerala, Karnataka, Andhra, these Telangana, these are all growingly sophisticated parts of India, which are, can attract investment, can create regional value chains in sector after sector. And then there could be other value chains in, for example, Sri Lanka and rubber, Pakistan in surgicals and medical equipment, sports goods between India and Pakistan, so on and so forth. Religious tourism in between Nepal and India and Bhutan, right? Where Bangladesh already has a value chain, and that can grow in other labor-intensive sectors. So, trust gap again, that you assuming that trade can resume, and I have written, pretty passionately about, trade resumption between India and Pakistan, as some of you may know, and if assuming that some trade, that sense will prevail and trade can resume, I think there is a lot that can happen between India and Pakistan, set the ball rolling, starting, as you said, in services. People don't have to cross borders. There can be a lot going on in services, and in time that can get into more ambitious forms of investment. So the specific question of Masood, right? So I appreciate, Masood, thanks for bringing to my attention the liberalization in Bangladesh. As you yourself said, there is still a long way to go. I'm in touch with some firms, some friends are there in Bangladesh, and obviously there are still restrictions. The very fact that you spoke, there are only 15 firms that are authorized to do this kind of outward investment, with still quite a lot of restrictions even for those firms. This means there is still a lot of discretion in policy making, which is something that as economists, obviously, we do not like that. But to your specific question about why Bangladeshis investing in Africa, I think, as you yourself said, at this stage, I'm thinking of things like AGOA, right? You are trying to take advantage of opportunities because remember, GSP has been taken away from Bangladesh by the United States. And on the other hand, there is the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act. So there could be some piggyback riding through that kind of investment and preparing for the next stage. So some countries in Africa are touted now. Are they the next labor-intensive sector? Nigeria, for example, Ethiopia. Are they the next? Will they be the next sort of centers of manufacturing? So some of the smarter, forward-looking Bangladesh firms are trying to get a head start by investing there. This is what strikes me as of now. We can have a more detailed discussion on this. But Amitendu, I'll stop here because I could go on, but I think, as you said, we try to leave some time for the questions.
Thank you, Sanjay. I think you have answered the questions that were raised for you. I think you did them in a fair bit of detail, and I think these are subjects which are so tantalizing in their scope and interest that we can keep them, sort of live and active for as much time as we want. But I just wanted to reflect on a couple of other thoughts and maybe bring in a couple of other panelists that we have into the discussion. Ganesh, this is a question for you. You'd recall that when the TPP was being crafted and United States was taking the lead, there was this view that once a country like Vietnam, which is a major garment exporter, gets preferential access into the United States market through the TPP, that will create major difficulties in competitive advantage for a country like Bangladesh, also for countries from South Asia who are garment exporters, including Sri Lanka and India. And so, in order to neutralize that lack of advantage, maybe even Nepal was thinking about this, in order to neutralize for that lack of advantage, it might be a better idea to shift to African countries as a base for production. And from there, as both Masood and Sanjay have alluded to, take advantage of the African Growth Opportunities Act and take the preferential access back into the US market. Of course, all those did not materialize because the US did not join the TPP. But what I wanted to check from you is that, do you feel that the free trade agreements across Asia and other parts of the world, the way they are being crafted, the way the rules of origin are being shaped, the way the preferential market accesses are being carved out, these are in some way influencing the pattern of investments from South Asia to other parts in Asia and elsewhere? Or also, if one looks at it from the other side, they're also in some ways preventing enough flow of FDI into South Asia, because South Asia till now is not really part of a very structured free trade agreement. Of course, there is the SAFTA, but SAFTA has its obvious limitations on market access, and it would be lovely to have your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Amitendu. That was a very interesting question about the role of FTAs in driving these patterns. Let me just start with the key point, which is how much has FDI been influenced within South Asia by these pattern of regional agreements crisscrossing South Asia. I mean, the first point I probably want to make is that typically FTAs are important on the margin in reducing trade costs, right? They do provide preferential access, and that can provide a tariff advantage of 10 to 15%. The real kicker in the trade cost point, I think, is about the wages and the red tape issue, right, within countries, right? So FTAs can help by providing an additional incentive. So that's the first point. And most FTAs that are useful in South Asia are between South Asia and East Asian countries, right? So, I mean, the wonderful one which hasn't quite lived to the potential is the one that you and I have written about, which is the Indo-Sri Lanka FTA, which is the most comprehensive FTA in South Asia. It's better than India's agreements with Japan or Korea, right, in terms of what it tries to do. Now, have they deflected trade towards South Asia, East Asia? I think on the margin, right? Because we don't really have agreements between China and South Asian countries. That will really be the kicker. Okay, Sri Lanka is talking about restarting China-Sri Lanka FTA discussion. Bangladesh, I think, is examining some of that. So basically, FTAs in general haven't had any impact so far. In East Asia, however, where value chains are much more developed, I think that FTAs are much more significant in influencing intra-regional FDI. And so it's a completely different story in East Asia, and they have been very important. Just one other point on the African movement from South Asian firms and using AGOA or any other incentives. That has been the case for a few Sri Lankan firms that I'm familiar with, but much of it depends on which country you go to. If you went to Kenya, that might be useful, okay, because Kenya is an important country, it has good logistics, it's increasingly linked into value chains with Europe, there's marketing and others. If you go to a country like Uganda, it may not be useful because Uganda is double landlocked, right? So you encounter big trade costs there. The other point about Africa is now they have a trade agreement right across Africa. So, you would be doing that as part of an international strategy towards Africa as a base, right? If you can source cotton and start producing textiles and so on, and then using AGOA to go. But thank you very much, Amitendu. Very good question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ganesh. In fact, I do share with your views on so far as the FTA and the investment connection is concerned. And I think one of the interesting areas that probably you, I, Sanjay, and the experts that we have on this panel for us to look into would probably be this specific issue that how are trade agreements influencing investments in the region and outside the region, and to what extent they are either abetting or preventing the evolution of effective supply chains. I think that's something on which maybe we can have a conversation going within this panel at an appropriate point in time. I now have to, I just wanted to check two questions that have come from the panel. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Sanjay who needs to respond to this, but I would like these questions have come from Masood and Dr. Pandey. So maybe what I would want to do is that start with Mr. Pandey's question, Dr. Pandey's question, that Nepal, Laos, and Bangladesh will graduate from LDCs by December 2026, and in view of the COVID pandemic, do you think the transition will be smooth and won't there be a risk to slide backwards because there will be a lot of benefits lost and preferential treatment sacrificed? Very valid concerns, Dr. Pandey. But on this, let me first take the view of Dr. Dil Bahadur Rahut. Dil, you are looking at two vantage points. One is, of course, you are looking at South Asia from the perspective of Bhutan, but at the same time, you are also with the multilateral institution, one of the largest donors in the region, the ADB, and you're based in Japan and have an extra-regional perspective on this question. So what are your thoughts on this? Three very important countries from South Asia graduating out of the LDC status at a point in time when the COVID has hit the world. So what are your thoughts on the prospects of this transition? You think there might be some downsides to it that were not envisaged before?
Thank you, Dr. Palit. This is a very interesting, very important question that has always been in my mind, in the sense that there are like beside these three countries, there are also other countries which are graduating from LDC to out of LDCs. But the challenge is that these countries are still poor in terms of if you look at the poverty rate is very, very high. And if you look at go beyond poverty, the hunger data or the food insecurity data, you'll see that South Asia has the highest number of people living, are food insecure moderately or even severely food insecure. That's second. And the third important things that I have always been looking is at the nutritional aspect. If you look at the percentage of populations living, who are undernourished, the stunting and not being able to afford healthy diets, it's highest globally. And with the pandemic, I think it has, situation has even worsened. I was thinking, looking at SDGs against the backdrop of climate change that's severely hitting the region and the COVID. I think it's not the right time. It's going to, this country, we are going to face challenges, by putting us into the other list. So I think this is something that we really have to think about, as to how we should move forward. And we are a very fragile region in the world.
Yeah. Thanks, Dil. On this very same question, Dr. Pandey, if I can have your views followed by Masood, your views, because you are from Nepal and Bangladesh, two countries who are poised to take that very big leap. But very briefly, if you don't mind.
Very briefly, it is quite sort of a nightmare here, because we are going to lose a lot of preferential treatment, especially with our garment, especially with our exports to the European Union and the United States. And now that we are graduating, we need a lot of support, not only because of the COVID pandemic, but also because of the devastating earthquake in 2015. That has created a lot of disturbance here in the economy, and the infrastructure lost, and a lot of our revenue has to now go into reconstruction of old heritage sites and old buildings and schools and colleges. So therefore, it's a completely different perspective that we are talking about with graduation. But I am very happy to know that ISAS is organizing a roundtable on LDC, I hear, very soon, and we'll be very happy to participate in that. Thank you.
Thank you. We look forward to your participation in that. Masood and I both look forward to it. Masood, your very quick thoughts on this particular issue of the graduation and the.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we have done some kinds of quantitative analysis on that also. I have done one paper. It's called Cost of Market Access, Cost of LDC Graduation on Market Access, evidence from Bangladesh. And where I develop a baseline, like 2026, and try to develop different types of scenario, like if European country, EU imports 9.6% import tariff importing from Bangladesh, what could be the impact on Bangladesh export? If Bangladesh also eliminate export subsidy, because it also major issues export subsidy, most of the developing country, Bangladesh also provide like around 10 to 15% export subsidy, cash export subsidy, different energy sector. So if this realize, if EU and other developed country, including Canada, Australia, except USA, even India, they impose tariff around 9 to 10%. So Bangladesh export could be decreased $7 to $10 billion by 2029. That is in my computer general equilibrium modeling, dynamic CGE. So that is I have prepared, and this paper is coming by one journal of economic system research. So there is a problem with the LDC graduation, and definitely Bangladesh and some other LDC country, they lose market access. But of course, EU and UK, they actually give another 3 years a grace period, so 2026 to 2029. So then maybe this real impact will be after that. But as I mentioned, Bangladesh is preparing for that, and they try to shift their plan from Bangladesh to even Africa, Haiti, Kenya, Ethiopia. So this kinds of shift is ongoing. Also, the government, the different domestic policy they are trying to stimulate, like non-tariff measures policy and tariff realization, FTA. Bangladesh is dealing with these things recently. And so we are expecting many things is going to change, and we are monitoring this progress also closely.
Thank you so much, Masood. Sanjay, we are nearly at the closing point, the finishing line. I won't really trouble you to again go back to the report and share your perspectives as a closing thought, because now I think what is important is for all of us who have been a part of the discussion today and the general wider public to actually read what you have written and then come back to you with our further thoughts that we have. But before we go, there's one specific question that Masood had, which I just thought if you might have some reflection on. And this is on whether Indian firms can borrow from the domestic market and invest in the overseas market. Are there any restrictions on this? I mean, to my understanding, I don't think there are any major operative restrictions, but it will be great if you could just clarify this very briefly.
Sure. Thank you, Masood, for that. Yeah, I agree with you, Amitendu. I do not think, because it's I mean, you know, at the end of the day, you're operating and you have diverse sources of finance. Including your own funds, domestic funds, overseas funds. So I think the operative restrictions are not so much on your, where you get your funds from, but are you actually allowed to invest your funds whatever the source might be? And as I said, there has been massive liberalization there, so that it's very free, almost free on the capital account to all intents and purposes for firms, and actually even for individuals. The limits are very high. To the best of my knowledge, there are no real serious restrictions on where the funds come from, or as I said. So Amitendu, if you allow me, I will have one final word, because I wanted to just draw on what Nishchal had said. And I like that very much. What he said is that, yes, so the regional trade, I think, as all of you have said, it can provide some of the dynamism, right? That the world is going through a very uncertain phase, and it will continue to be. But the region is coming back strong, right? At least in terms of the growth rates and so on. So I think that it can ride on itself through some of the things that we mentioned. But Nishchal's point was, can we get to earlier levels of connectivity, right? So I really liked that. And it's in fact something that I'm thinking about in my new book that I'm writing now at the Wilson Center, how we can actually help create some of those older levels of connectivity that we were used to, where we never used to even think about it, right? Yeah. It was taken as that we had fantastic levels of connectivity. So thank you for that, and thank you for this opportunity, Amitendu and Isas, and to all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. I mean, we need to profusely thank you for the excellent work that you have done and the time that you have taken for sharing your insight with us. I really, really couldn't agree with you more on the question of connectivity, along with Nishchal. Personally, I think we have all experienced this. As South Asians, it is so much easier to travel outside South Asia than within South Asia. And it is such a great pity. I mean, the barriers to movement are so much within South Asia, selectively, bilaterally, as opposed to the complete or near complete lack of barriers that exist for most of us when we travel to Southeast Asia or other parts of Asia. So I hope someday, with the wisdom and knowledge that we gain from illuminating work like the one that you have done, will help us to understand the great importance of the knowledge, trust, connectivity nexus that you have brought us to, and the benefits that it can have for greater investment, greater trade, and economic integration of the region. I wanted to close this conversation today by sharing two things with you. The first is that we from the Institute of South Asian Studies and the Trade and Economics program that we run, I have the great pleasure and privilege of running this program along with the support of very, very distinguished colleagues like Mr. Vinod Rai, Sanjay, Ganesh, who are non-resident fellows with us, Dr. Pandey, Dil, good friends, and Dr. Sajid. We hope to engage with you much more as we go ahead. And of course, Masood, who is a very important part of our program, backed by our director, Dr. Iqbal Singh Sivia, and our deputy director, Hanek Singh. We are continuously looking to engage and connect on evolving issues. that are going on around South Asia. So I will request all of you to share ideas with us. And there are ideas which, in fact, I have picked up from today's conversation and which we would like to cultivate as we go ahead. So please keep engaged on this subject. And the final thought that I wanted to share with you is that Masood alluded to a program that we are having next week on the 25th on the subject of LDCs, the challenges that they might experience during transition. So I think we will find some resonance in that program along with what we have discussed today. So please join us that day once again. Thank you so much. It's been lovely having all of you with us today. We hope that we will be getting the opportunity to connect very closely again. And we hope that COVID will not remain a barrier for us in establishing connectivity and connections. And somewhere down the year, we'll be able to meet each other physically and face-to-face as well. Thank you so much for the time. And let me now return this to Kuntavi. Kuntavi, for you.
Thank you, everyone. On behalf of ICES, we'd like to extend our thanks to the panelists and moderator for an engaging and insightful discussion. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at upcoming events.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye.